All right, thank you. So as people are coming back in, I know sometimes it takes a little while for people to come in. But I see people rejoining us, and I want to start by saying, before I turn it over to Mr. Day to moderate the forum this evening, that as we saw earlier, there were some pretty hateful, homophobic, racist, sexist things that were stated in the chat box before and in the Q&A box. And on behalf of the City of College Park, I want to apologize. I want to apologize that we were not prepared to deal with that and address that as it came up, and that people saw something that might have been triggering to many people. I can say that we were all very disturbed by what took place. It was highly inappropriate, and we have taken steps to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But it does show, I think, exactly why we're having conversations like this, because there is still a lot of hatred, a lot of racism out there, and it's only through conversations like this that we can work to educate, work to heal, work to come together as a community and overcome, defeat hatred like that. So I appreciate, thank all of you who stuck around. Apologize for the delay and apologize for what you had to see before. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Day. Where's Mr. Day?
That my understanding is we just had a very large lightning strike hit somewhere near Mr. Day's house, and he was bumped off the conversation and is trying to get back on. So with that, we may just want to start and go around the room and do a quick introduction as we wait for Mr. Day to try to come back into the meeting. Maybe we can start with our elected officials, and then Mayor, perhaps you could interview or introduce our guests.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Summers. I'm Patrick Wynn, Mayor of the City of College Park. I'll go around and I see Mr. Day coming back on. So why don't I have my fellow elected officials, first our City Manager, Scott Summers, introduce himself. Other elected officials and city staff can introduce ourselves, and then Mr. Day Obiana can introduce the panel.
Mr. Mayor, I will start. Monroe Dennis, council member in District 2 from the City of College Park. District 2 includes Lakeland, the historically African-American community of the City of College Park. Also includes the neighborhoods of Berwyn and Branchville and Daniels Park.
I guess I'll go next. My name is John Rigg. I represent District 3, and I had the pleasure of co-representing that district with our esteemed facilitator, Robert Day. District 3 includes the College Park neighborhoods of Old Town, Calvert Hills, Yarrow, and College Park Estates. It also includes what we would refer to as sort of downtown College Park and a good chunk of the dormitories in Southern College Park. So it's my pleasure to represent the College Park substantial Greek life community, as well as a number of student residents in South Campus Commons, Terrapin Row, and other developments in the Guilford Road corridor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Day. I'm the other part of District 3 representation. I'm also going to be your moderator for tonight's event. And has all of our council members been able to introduce themselves?
Our District 4 colleagues need to introduce themselves still.
All right. There we go. On you, Denise.
Oh, wait, okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Denise Mitchell, council member for District 4, which is the west part of the city of College Park, which includes Crystal Springs, Acredale, Cherry Hill, Otterville, and College Park Woods. And I'm truly delighted to be here this evening to talk about this subject with everyone.
Hi, I'm Maria Mackey. I'm the other District 4 council member. I am too excited to hear what everyone has to say, and I'm looking forward to hearing, especially from our esteemed guests. And I thank you so much for coming and doing this for us.
Okay, hey, Patrick, have you had a chance to make your statement yet? I got kicked off. I've lost internet in my home, so I had to get on by phone. So I'm get it.
I did. Go ahead, Mr. Day. The floor is yours.
Okay, so I want to first thank everybody to the continuing of the conversation that we had about policing and Black Lives Matter in our virtual forum. I would love to have this in person, but we are stuck in our COVID situation, so I want to thank everybody for coming. I think the first thing I want to do is introduce our panelists. I would like our city manager to give us a brief update on anything that may have happened in the city due to the storm that just rolled through, and then I'll get into the panelists, and then we'll get our conversation started. Mr. Summers?
Yes, thank you. Well, so far, so good. I'm actually sitting right next, I'm in my office actually, but our office is right next to the Paint Branch Creek, and I've been watching that creek rise to at least 2 feet above its normal banks. We have our staff, code, parking, and our contract officers exploring the city. They are driving along Guilford Run, Narragansett Run, in low-lying areas such as Calvert Hills. So far, so good. We have not seen the flooding that is certainly possible and probable in this area. We haven't seen any large trees down or large branches yet. I continue to hear the rain coming down, so it's certainly possible by the end of the night we could see some localized flooding, and we could also see some trees or wires down. But I just wanted everyone on the call to know that the city is out there. We are monitoring the situation. I wanted to let everyone know so far, so good. Thank you.
Excuse me, Scott, just received some information. My colleague just received some information in regards to Cherry Hill Road. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
We've dispatched contract officers up there to go have a look.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So first, I'd like to say we have some great panelists today for our discussion. The 4 panelists we have is our Prince George's County representative, our District 1 commander, Major Holly. We also have Dr. Barberin, who is a professor of African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland at College Park. We have Dr. Nickerson, who is, I believe he's this, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Nickerson, but I believe you're Assistant Dean of Diversity at the University of Maryland at College Park, and is also part of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences as an Assistant Dean in Diversity. So, and he has been there for quite a while. And our final panelist is Ms. Sika Wheeler. She's Assistant Director of Diversity Programming and Engagement at the University of Maryland. I think all of our panelists will bring some great insight to our discussion. And we're going to start off with the policing part of our discussion for today. And Major Holland, I would like to ask you a couple of questions just about the 8 Can't Wait discussion. I think you guys, when we put out the call to all of our police forces that, really respond to College Park, Prince George's County almost was instantaneous in their response. And we thank you for that, because it's always good to know that our police are responding to us. And, I just want to ask, how do you see that growing? And are there any issues that you see with the current 8 Can't Wait responses that are coming out from, or 8 Can't Wait requests that are coming from communities in Prince George's County, including the College Park, greater College Park area?
Good evening. First of all, good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Always look forward to my partnership with College Park. I've been in law enforcement in the county for over 30 years. 21 of those at Prince George's County Police, and 18 of the 21 have been right here at District 1 for the last year and a half, of which I've been the commander. So very familiar with College Park, and I'm always pleased to be able to be a partner with the city and keep things moving forward. That being said, one of the things over my career, when I saw this 8 Can't Wait pop up, I looked through it and was just proud that the Prince George's County Police Department is actually, before this ever really came to the forefront, had already implemented all of these processes, everything that's been asked for. I mean, starting with the very first one, the chokeholds. In my entire 21-year career, the chokeholds and carotid restraints, barring a life and death situation where deadly force would be authorized, those have been explicitly prohibited by the police department. The de-escalation is the second part of that. We've worked with the training staff in de-escalation and negotiating is our initial response to any potential force incident. And we work with not only our training staff, but we also partnered with crisis response, which is external groups of psychologists and psychiatrists that work with the department to help us enhance our skills when it comes to de-escalation techniques. Moving down the list, I think the next one is warning shots. Require warning before shooting, and it's whenever that's feasible. It's absolutely it's written in the policy that before unless it's a situation where it requires immediate action, like if a gun is being held on a citizen and we have no time. But it's the policy of the department to before you discharge your weapon to administer warnings that you have your weapon and you're going to use it if the situation doesn't settle. And the next one that's part and parcel to that is requires exhausts all other alternatives before shooting, and that's absolutely through de-escalation and all the other processes that we have and all the less lethal tools that we have. It's absolutely we follow a continuum, which is one of the other points in here is a use of force continuum, and we follow a use of force continuum that requires us whenever feasible to start at the lowest level, which is talking, and then as the situation warrants, escalate only when it's necessary. The duty to intervene, we have been teaching that for a number of years. In the last several years, there's been several incidents in the county where that's actually come to play, where officers have intervened and stopped action from taking place and brought that the bad actors to the attention of their superiors and to internal affairs, where we have ended up getting cases where officers have been immediately removed from duty when the situation warrants that. Then in consultation with internal affairs and the state's attorney's office, we've had several cases where officers have been charged with a crime of assault, and ultimately, obviously after being convicted, terminated from the department. Banning shooting at moving vehicles, that's explicitly written in policy that in another situation, unless it's absolutely 100% necessary and the person in the car is putting somebody in immediate danger where there's no other alternative. Other than that, we're prohibited from shooting at moving cars. And back to the 7 and 8, the use of force continuum, we've been following that for a number of years. And then the following is comprehensive reporting. And each and every use of force, each and every time that an officer uses force, whether it's just a matter of taking somebody and pushing them down to the ground, all the way up to and including if they, unfortunately had to shoot somebody, every time that they use force, they're required to report that to the on-duty supervisor, who's required to do a preliminary investigation, which gets forwarded up through the entire chain of command from the sergeant, the lieutenant, the captain, to me, to the major at each of the respective districts or under each command. And then once it meets all, if it meets all the policies and procedures of the department, then it gets forwarded over to internal affairs. And the training academy also gets copies of each and every one of those to evaluate the situations that we're using force and try to come up with better, more improved training in order to get us, to a place where we can try to find ways, whether it's going back to de-escalation or other alternatives to try to more effectively, be able to perform our duties, and ideally without having to resort to force. But unfortunately, in some circumstances, there's no way around that. So round that all up, we've been on the leading edge of trying to stay on top of these 8 can't wait. And, we're always looking for, the newest best practices to try to stay on the front edge of the curve, because we're always looking for ways that we can improve. That's why discussions like this are so important, so we can gauge what the community is feeling and make sure we're partnering with the community to make sure we're performing as effectively as we can out there.
Well, I will say thank you for that. I will definitely say that the placement of the COPS officers in College Park has been a great addition to our communication between the police force and the residents of College Park. I know that I have been in conferences and places and brought up the COPS program, and a lot of people are very impressed with what you guys have been doing with that. Are there any plans to look to expand that at all, or maybe grow that within the communities around here?
Right now, staffing is a challenge to try to expand that. Recruiting has been extremely difficult over the last few years. One of the things that, like I said before, I've been with Prince George's County for 21, and before that, I spent 11 years at a municipal agency. And at a municipality, I got the feeling, of being, because it's smaller, I got the feeling of being closer with the community. So one of the things I try to do, because of my experience working with the municipality before I joined the county, is I try to take that mindset. And it's difficult with the way that our beat officers work, but I try to get them with the mindset that, not exactly what COPS does, not what the COPS officers do, but to get them that mindset that they're, equally responsible for being an interactive part of that community, and, to try to encourage them when they work a specific beat to get to know the ins and outs of that community a little bit better. And some of the principles and philosophies that COPS uses on a grander scale, I try to get those on at least a small scale, get that mindset instilled in the beat officers, the regular patrol officers that work in those various communities.
Okay. So, in the wake of the George Floyd incident, Prince George's County came up with a police reform task force. And I'd like to hear your input on that and how you think it's going, and was it needed and why it was created?
It was created from the county executive's office. As a matter of fact, Chief Velez, interim Chief Velez, is participating in a meeting tonight with that task force. Is why he's unable to be here. He may be able to pop in at some point, but he's actually participating. I want to say tonight was their 6th meeting, maybe. So I always think it's I think it's a good idea. I think the culture around policing right now, I think it was important to put a group together to try to study and evaluate exactly where the police department stands today. I think one of the tasks that group is performing pretty diligently is going section by section and piece by piece within the department and analyzing each of those things. One meeting was dedicated to recruiting, for example. Another meeting was dedicated to the internal affairs and the internal investigative process. So each of the different components of the department is being examined through the course of these meetings. And when they get to the finish line, that hopefully they have some recommendations for how we can continue to improve. Because that's one of the things that I think is important, is that when it comes to things like police reform, sometimes I think reform might be a little bit I always like to say we need to constantly, continually refine ourselves. We always need to work on getting better. As I said, I've been around for 30 years. I've seen a lot of changes over those 30 years in law enforcement, but every single day, no matter where we are, I think it's always important, whether it's through this task force or through internal conversations that we have or through community relations that we have, that we're always striving to try to make ourselves better than we are today.
So what are the goals, some of the goals that you would like to see as a district commander come out of this task force, and how would you like to implement those throughout the city?
Ideally for me as a district commander, I hope that they kind of recognize that we need a little bit of assistance with staffing, so I can dedicate more units to some of these cops issues and things like that. That's me being selfish as a district commander that's responsible for one district. And I'm sure if you asked every other commander on the police department, they would say the same thing about their unit. But ultimately, I hope that the reforms that they end up implementing end up working so that we can continue to build the relationships that we have with the cops officers and expand those to the patrol officers, and continue to get out there and work with the communities as we have over the last, I'd say, 15, 20 years. The relationship that we've had with the community in College Park and throughout the rest of the areas in the county has grown substantially. And I'd just like to see that whatever reforms are put in place allow us to continue building on those relationships that we've already established.
So can you tell us, I know there's an open period coming for the police task force. Do you have any dates or times for that? And when do they expect to finalize this task force and create a report for the community?
I don't have any of the specific dates. I know that, like I said, I know one of the meetings is tonight, and I believe this is the sixth meeting that they've had. The original plan, and I don't know what they're going to uncover as they go through the process, but the original plan was to have a report ready to present to the county executive and to the county council by the end of October, preliminarily. But like I said, as they uncover new things and as they dig deeper into certain areas, that may get postponed somewhat. But I know the original plan was to try to have that wrapped up by the end of October.
Well, thank you for that, Major Holland. I think that kind of covers the police part of what we were trying to make sure that we keep up to date with that and stay in communication with the police department. I want to thank you and your staff for everything you're doing in Prince George's County to keep us safe. We appreciate and always look forward for ways to work with the police department to better serve our citizens in the city of College Park and the greater area of College Park. So I just want to say thank you for that.
It's my pleasure, and I look forward to continuing my work closely with College Park as we continue to move to make things better for all of us.
So with that, I will we'll shift over a little bit to our Black Lives Matter discussion. And I am going to go this one.
I don't know if I know you're on your phone instead of your computer, so you may not. Okay, because we wanted to just point out too, we've been chatting amongst the panelists, so we wanted to make sure that the attendees know that if you have a question, we are handling them through our city clerk, Janine Miller, and if you'd like to submit a question for the panelists, you can do that by emailing it to CPMC, that's CPMC for College Park Mayor and Council, at collegeparkmd.gov. So again, that's CPMC at collegeparkmd.gov. And then I did want to see if, I think if people have been submitting questions to Ms. Miller, I don't know if she's gotten any already that she would like to say for Major Holland at this point. None yet, okay. All right, none at this point. But if people do have questions, again, that's CPMC at collegeparkmd.gov. Thank you.
All right. I'll just say thank you to my kids for doing all the stuff in the background, for getting me back on my internet because it wiped us out. But So with that, I'll say let's move to our Black Lives Matter. Major Holland, I hope you can stick around, and if we do get some questions for you, we will shoot those over to you and get some input from you. But I am going to throw that first question out there for our Black Lives Matter movement panelists. And the first question is going to be, what is the Black Lives Matter movement and what is it not? And I would love to have our panelists start. I will start with Dr. Barberin and go from there.
I think at its core, it's a movement to raise consciousness about racism. So it's not only just police violence, it's not just the few incidents that have occurred that have stimulated, but it's a broader set of issues that racism runs deeply in this country, that it is a way of maintaining white hegemony. It is a way of maintaining the disempowerment of Black people particularly, and that any effort to eliminate it, to fight it, is going to be met with equal resistance, because there are lots of things to be lost if this racist hegemony no longer exists. It's also a statement that the people who are the victims of racism are human. They are of worth. They are people who deserve respect. They're not the images that are often presented in the media as threatening, as ignorant, as incapable, as lazy, but they represent a people who are struggling under immense odds to overcome. And that it's a stand, basically it's a stand that says, we demand respect, we demand equality, not tomorrow, but today.
Thank you. Dr. Nicholson, do you have anything you'd like to put in on that one?
So that was really well put by Dr. Barberin. So let me provide the audience with some context that might be confusing to people, because some people might have only heard of Black Lives Matter in 2020 or maybe 2019. But Black Lives Matter as a movement and as in common parlance, a hashtag, really began in 2013 after the acquittal of the gentleman who murdered Trayvon Martin in Florida. So 3 women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, began talking about, didn't Trayvon Martin's life mean anything? Didn't it matter? And so they started this hashtag, and with social media today, it took off, where people began recounting their own experiences in which it appeared that this country and its institutions were treating African Americans as if our lives didn't matter. Now, from there, organizations began forming around Black Lives Matter and taking on the Black Lives Matter moniker. However, as Dr. Barberin pointed out, Black Lives Matter is more than just a moniker and an organization. So the meaning of it transcends any organizational structure that actually might exist. So there are Black Lives Matter chapters, but these chapters are loosely organized. There's no, the movement in general has been that any and everyone can and are encouraged to participate, to say those things that Dr. Barberin just said, and that is, Black lives do matter. And although as a hashtag and as a movement, it began with a discussion around murdering and injustice and around not bringing those who murder African Americans to justice. It has transcended into other sectors as well. So now we talk about Black Lives Matter, and we can tell if they matter by how we structure our education system, or how we structure our economic systems, or how we structure our medical systems. So for example, if Black Lives Matter, people would say, why do we have this disparity in people who are dying from COVID, for example? So just to provide the audience with a little context, there are organizations that call themselves Black Lives Matter organizations, but there's also broader buy-in to the general public that Black Lives Matter, and from grassroots, they want to participate in this movement just as they did in the civil rights movement. One didn't have to be a member of the NAACP or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to participate in the civil rights movement. You could just say, I believe in civil rights and participate. That might be an easy way for people to understand Black Lives Matter.
I think, thank you for that. I think a lot of what people are starting to realize is the social injustice and social inequity when it comes to those issues, just like you brought up, when you talk about the health and the education and the housing. I mean, you can go down a list of things and you can start picking apart the different social inequities that we have. And I think Black Lives Matter does try to address those needing to be met. So, like you were saying, there's many different chapters, and some of those chapters, they all have their need to attack certain issues in their communities that are lacking and need to be brought to the forefront and be discussed. So Ms. Wheeler, I'm gonna ask you, and I kind of gave you a heads up about this, yes, Black Lives Matter movement is a movement, but it is also tied and very closely simulates other movements like our movement with the LGBTQ plus community. And I think, that is something that, we have to realize that we all have to work together to solve these problems. It's not just an issue where it's only one group that is being, that is lacking social equity. So could you talk about where you might see some of those cross points and how you think what Black Lives Matter in that scenario?
Absolutely, and I think I also want to just add a little bit to what Dr. Barberin and Dr. Nickerson talked about. I think the context is absolutely important. I had just graduated college when Trayvon Martin was killed. For a lot of millennials, that was a huge moment, and really seeing at that time, I had already known, obviously, that racism existed, was something that affected my life, my family's life. And I didn't think that, if a video came out and everyone saw the video, heard the video, that it would lead to the decision that was made when George Zimmerman was acquitted. I worked at a news station at that time in my hometown in North Carolina. And so I remember the coverage that we did, and I also remember the confusion and the resistance to that slogan of Black Lives Matter, in the control room, right behind the camera. And so I think it's been really interesting over the past couple of years to see the ways that, this phrase Black Lives Matter has completely shifted, and it's become this thing where, when I take a walk outside, my daily walk, my COVID walk, I see numerous Black Lives Matter signs, but I remember not being allowed to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts, right, to school, or not being able to wear them when I was instructing in graduate school. And so I think the tone of Black Lives Matter has changed a lot, and I think that really bears acknowledging. I also think Black Lives Matter is a continuation, like Dr. Nickerson talked about, of the Black radical tradition. It is a continuation of the fight for civil rights, which has been going on for centuries now. It is a part of a long history of Black resistance, and something that was very meaningful to me as a Black queer woman at that time was to see the ways not only that they included Black LGBT people in their vision of Black liberation, but they were led by and they explicitly centered queer Black people, right? And so I think sometimes we think of these movements as somehow separate, but to me, they are actually the same, right? It is a fight for liberation. And so even if we think about the Stonewall riots, as they're called, those were carried out and led by Black queer people or Latinx queer people. And so I think it's deeply important to understand the ways that the liberation of Black people includes all Black people, and that Black Lives Matter was really a moment where there was a recognition that the way that we were doing Black liberation, at least publicly, right, in the 60s and the 50s and, years past, really invisibilized people who are actually central and core to the broader liberation of Black people. And so that's something that means a lot to me, and that feels like it's very central to the current Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So what does it really mean to support the movement itself? And how do you see people accepting or not accepting, supporting the movement? And I open that up to any of our panelists, just kind of throw it out there. Thank you. Still on mute.
Dr. Barberin, it seems like you're mute.
Yeah.
I see your mouth moving.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I switched to a professional mic, but it's not working.
Yeah.
Should have stuck with my computer. Anyway, I was just noting that Ms. Wheeler has pointed out very aptly that the term Black Lives Matter in the movement have been internalized, or one could say co-opted or used, adopted very broadly. And to some extent, I think that's the most amazing thing about what is happening, and perhaps a source of inspiration. But a term that has arisen during this period is the notion of ally, which I thought was, that sort of the ally, that if someone wants to participate in the movement, then one has to not just consciously accept the ideas, but to truly act as an ally in whatever domain one lives in, whether it is a university administrator, a teacher in the classroom, a politician, that you have access and influence over people's lives, and you use that to promote equality. It means for white people, a recognizing and acceptance and a consciousness raising prior to being allies. So we don't need allies who are going to join marches and tear down places, tear down our communities. That's not the kind of allies we need. But we need people who are willing to take whatever resources they have, whatever influence they have, and use it to promote equality. And so sometimes that means giving up privilege, recognizing and giving up their position of privilege, or at least bringing in others, sharing it, removing the impediments and the blocks.
So I want to take what Dr. Barberin has said, and I want to turn it around in a way that maybe might be jarring for the audience, but I think it's really important to understand. Dr. Barberin talked about it's amazing that this term ally has come up. I want to talk specifically about what's amazing, and that is the pushback that people get from saying Black Lives Matter in a way that Ms. Wheeler mentioned. Now I want to take you back to the 1950s, and I want you to remember that one of the key pieces of evidence submitted to the Supreme Court that ultimately helped win Brown versus Board of Education was the Clark and Clark doll study that suggested that it was detrimental to African-American children to not expose them to images that looked like them, that their self-esteem could be harmed, and that through integration and making sure that schools were funded appropriately, students could have a better self-image and could educate themselves. So there was nothing wrong back then with us saying it's important that African Americans, people from the Black diaspora, had positive self-images and that they could see these positive self-images. Fast forward 15 years later, there was a popular song by James Brown, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." Were there people in the streets saying, you're not allowed to say that you're proud to be Black? All we're saying when we're saying that Black Lives Matter is we're human. Our lives mean just as much as you. So I say to people who push back against people saying Black Lives Matter, that's tantamount to saying to people, you cannot say it loud that you're Black and you're proud. Because if you say that you're Black and you're proud, that means that you're not proud of me, which just doesn't make sense. And so I'm constantly trying to help people understand the message of Black Lives Matter. But it's not just people of the African diaspora accepting that their lives matter, but it's also everyone accepting that our lives matter. And no matter what profession you're in, you recognize that if there is a group that seems to not be getting it, the services they need or doing as well as others, you say we need to give help there because they matter too. So earlier, your city manager was talking about flooding or potential flooding in an area. And if you found that there was flooding in an area and those citizens of College Park needed help, you would dispatch help in that direction because you'd say, they're part of the College Park community, they matter. We're saying we're part of humanity, we matter. And it's, once again, amazing to me that there are people who are recoiling against saying that our lives matter as well.
Well, I'll just say we had a little bit of a taste of that early on when the city put out its Black Lives Matter signage, and they were defaced by painting out the word Black so that only it would say Lives Matter. I was standing and listening to a couple of people basically having a heated conversation about the discussion of what it really meant. And it really came down to one side said, you know, all lives matter. And he said, the simple fact that you're saying all lives matter, does it mean that Black lives matter? And the person at first said, no, it doesn't mean that, it means all lives matter. Well, if all lives matter, then Black Lives Matter is part of that too. And that discussion is what people are missing in the long or the big picture of this. And it took a little while for the guy to get his point across, and then all of a sudden it clicked. And the person said, you know what? I don't want to discuss this anymore because I don't think you're understanding what I'm saying. He said, no, I clearly hear what you're saying, but you need to understand that all lives are, all humanity is something that needs to be addressed. And when you leave out a certain group in that discussion, that group then is going to say, hey, what about me? How am I included in that discussion? And that is part of what Black Lives Matter, I think, is trying to accomplish or should be trying to accomplish, is to make sure that we are part of that discussion. And yes, I mean, that same type of discussion happens over and over again for many different segments of our community. I mean, we just had women's suffrage, 100 years of that. What was said then is the same thing that's kind of being said now. They weren't part of a solution. They wanted to be part of a solution. We're part of a solution. We're part of the whole. We should be considered part of the whole in all parts of humanity. So, you know, it's just, I might have a little different way of looking at it, but it's just, we're all part of humanity that comes together to create a whole. But when you start to disenfranchise a certain group and they see this social injustice, they are going to speak up for themselves. They're going to make their voices heard. And that's how you have to enact change.
May I
So we did,
may
go
I
ahead.
just add that we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter if, when people said all lives matter, they understood that Black, you know. In our Constitution, all men are created equal, but they didn't mean Black men and women. They meant white. So it was, so there are lots of things that are unstated that the Black Lives Matter is bringing in bold relief. It's putting in people's face that when you say all men are created equal, you really didn't mean us. And if you took the idea of Black Lives Matter seriously, you realize how much trouble we are in. Because Black kids are not doing well, Black men are not doing, Black women, Black families, because of the kinds of oppression they've experienced all along. And so to say Black Lives Matter is simply to put a point on the fact that all lives matter and that we have to include Blacks in that.
So I just wanted to add a little something to deepen the conversation a little bit. I think, because the original question, right, was how can people support Black Lives Matter? And I do want to say there's a billion ways, because the reality of white supremacy and racism in our country manifests in a billion ways. And so the contemporary abolitionist Derica Purnell said this thing on a webinar that I keep thinking about, which is just keep running, like start running, right? So there's not going to be some simple, beautiful entry point where, aha, this is the perfect way to support Black Lives Matter. You just have to be committed, right? And your commitment will lead you to your next steps. But I also want to trouble the idea that, right, when people said, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, that there was no resistance, or that when people were trying to, women's suffrage, that there was no resistance. I think an important piece of really situating ourselves in the now is to be able to see the unromanticized version of history, right? When you think about Martin Luther King, I remember I asked my niece, she was talking about, she's 8 years old. We learned about Martin Luther King today in class. I asked, well, what did you learn? And she said that he had a dream, right? And I think that's kind of as much as a lot of us know. Martin Luther King was a person who made a speech. He led some marches, and then they just handed over civil rights, right? That's not how resistance works. That's not how organizing works, right? There's years and years and years of resistance, right? And so the current Black Lives Matter movement, like I was talking about, there were years of resistance before we saw what we're seeing today. And so I want to talk specifically about anti-Blackness, because the reason why it's so threatening to people to hear people say Black Lives Matter, to hear people say, I'm Black and I'm proud, or Black pride, or whatever, to say I'm pro-Black, is because the way that white supremacy has been constructed is against Blackness, right? When white folks, the social construction of whiteness, and what I mean is that white is not this thing that exists naturally. It is something that people came up with in the sense of invented, right? But that there was always this question of what are we going to do about those Black people that we brought to this country, right? The Negro problem. And so in order to justify the treatment of Black people in this country, or in order to justify colonization, there had to be some sort of reason, right? And so all of these stereotypes, the imagery, the violence against Black people is to justify the hoarding of power and resources for white folks. And not even all white folks, right? White folks who own property, white males, right? So we have to have a larger and really more nuanced understanding of not just racism, but anti-Blackness specifically, and how Black people have become the measure of what, the sort of like the worst thing to wake up as. I'm thinking about Native Son, the novel by Richard Wright, where he talks about, you have, it's sort of like a measuring stick, right? Where white people are at the top, white women are under that, right? And it's not that neat and pretty, but we know that Black people are at the bottom, right? And you can understand this by saying, would you like to wake up tomorrow and be Black? A lot of non-Black people would say, oh, I'm not too sure. And so I think that's what I mean when I say anti-Blackness. And so when people say Black Lives Matter, it is a direct challenge to the supremacy of whiteness, this thing that we call whiteness, which does not actually exist, right? Because Irish people were not originally considered white. Italian people were not originally considered white. White is something that has been created in order to accomplish something, in order to hoard resources, in order to hoard money, in order to hoard power and the ability to enact violence against other people. So it just is, it's imperative to really be able to see it for what it is and to not think that there has not been resistance all along the way. When we see people like Donald Trump, when we see resistance to Black Lives Matter, we shouldn't be surprised and outraged at all. Right, that's just the way that it has been for centuries at this point.
I totally agree with you. I know one of the, I was asked what was the first thing that I can think of going back in time as far as I can to think about what was one of the first symbols of resistance that stood out that you can think of as being a symbol that the world saw. And I go back and I think to when they put up the Black Power fist at the Olympics and, learning about that and reading about that and growing up in a family who has, been fighting this for a long time, since the 50s. And realizing that there was social injustice in the education of children. So I understand that the fight is there and it's going to continue to be there. We have to continue fighting. And yes, we have to keep running. We have to find a way to, we're not going to solve, there's no silver bullet, and we're not going to solve it overnight. But we have to keep fighting. We have to keep looking for the wins that we can get. And we have to work with everyone that wants to join our fight to keep it going. So I'm going to move it to the next little question. We did have a question come in about why, and I know this is a question that gets thrown to Black Lives Matter a lot nationally and regionally and, in the different chapters, and is why do we not hear Black Lives Matter comment on Black crime in cities, in regions around our country? I'd like to hear what our panelists have to say about that, just in addressing it. I don't think we're going to have the answer for it, but I would like to understand how people are thinking about it. And that will lead me into my next question. Anyone want to take that one on?
Well, if I were engaged in a conversation with whoever asked the question, I would ask them, who are they listening to? I mean, really, who are they listening to? Are they actually listening to the African-American community? Because the African-American community is in a constant conversation about these challenges and about what to do about these challenges. We're not ignoring those issues. What I fear, from what I've heard from most of the people who ask that question, is they're not attending the churches, they're not attending the schools, they're not members of the civic organizations, they're not members of family discussions, because if they were, they'd know we are talking about these things. But what happens in movements is people understand how to throw distractions. And this movement is so focused that they're not going to fall for being distracted by that type of question anymore. They're simply not. If you don't think people are trying to address those issues, then you're really not seriously paying attention. We have several scholars, several activists who work on these issues every day. It's simply not true that these issues aren't talked about. And it's not going to deter us from the fact that we still have major problems with targeting of African Americans, with disparities that range from health to justice, to economic development, to education, and that we have active resistance to even allow people to say that if you believe all lives matter, then by definition, you have to believe that Black lives matter. So can you say it? Can you say it with me? Black lives matter. And they won't even say that.
I have to agree with that. There are a lot of three-letter organizations out there that you don't want to discuss or talk about, but they're out there. And the fact that they try and treat BLM as the same as maybe a KKK in some ways, it is kind of offending to me, but it's because they're missing the understanding of what Black Lives Matter is. But part of that really comes from having the true conversations about race and race relations and social equity. And I'll just say this, and you guys probably know better than I, but having those discussions is hard. And it's going to hurt people's feelings on both sides. But people need to understand that the only way to get an understanding and to build a concept or a vision of something is to have a conversation that is tough, that is going to hurt your feelings or bring out, those feelings in you that need to be addressed. And how do we do that in our communities? I know having forums like this and having, meetings and talking about it and hoping that we can spread the knowledge and get a better understanding. But are there other ways that we could really build upon having that discussion, even though it's going to hurt some people's feelings? But how do we, have that discussion, without trying to intentionally offend people? Anyone want to jump on that one before
So Robert, do you mind if I respond?
I?
Just
Go ahead, jump.
so I mean, I'm a policy person. I'm an elected official. I naturally gravitate towards policy solutions. I'm not sure that I have one, because if there was one, we would have done it. For me personally, and I'm going to be real vulnerable and real honest, right? Like, it starts with critical self-examination, and especially for white people, it starts with critical self-examination. And it starts with frank acknowledgement of our own inherent racism. I was raised in a small town in the Intermountain West, as most of you know, had maybe 5% African-American population. I was raised a racist. I am a recovering racist. I'm also a recovering homophobe. I acknowledge that. I do everything that I can to try to empower my friends, neighbors, and colleagues who are different from me, who may be subject to this inherent bias that I have baked in the cake that is me, a kid from a small town in the Intermountain West. And I'm still working on it. I'm still a work in progress. I need to work more on it. And I need, critical self-examination is what starts with it. Open and frank conversations with friends, neighbors, community members, people of color, people of the LGBTQ community, people of other diverse communities is a part of it. Looking for policy solutions to things that obviously disadvantage and make unequal our own city government specific to this conversation, but I would love to go bigger than our own city government. This is just the area in which I have some direct influence is part of it. But it has to start with critical self-examination, in my opinion, on behalf of like white cisgendered dudes from the Intermountain West. It starts with critical self-examination. It starts with learning and getting to know, develop deep relationships and friendships with people from diverse communities, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm here as a student. I want to learn. I want to continue my path to becoming a non-racist, non-homophobic person. I wish I was there. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it.
Thank you, John.
I'm glad that you mentioned being a student, John. I think the piece about learning is really important, about self-awareness and self-examination is really important. But I do want to go back to what you talked about, Robert, in terms of this being an emotional conversation. I think there has to be a certain level of acceptance that there's no way to talk about racism and for it to be nice and pretty and beautiful, right? And I think a lot of times the ways that we try to confront racism is by talking, by having conversation, by having dialogue. And I'm absolutely not saying that, like, there is not some sort of binary between discussing and learning and then doing action, but they have to serve each other, right? And so, and I'm not talking about just, signing a petition, although that has its place. I think people have to be building community, joining communities. There are already people who are doing this work and who have been doing it for their entire lives and who have principles around this, who have vision around this. And so you have to be able to, be discerning about who you're listening to, who you're following, et cetera. But, when you have that moment of outrage of, I can't believe that this is happening, you have to ask yourself, well, who else is doing something about this already? Right? And you have to follow their lead. So that's one piece of it. I feel like history is one piece. Like I said, like there's a million different ways to be having these conversations, but I love the piece from Professor Brittany Cooper, who says, we need to be asking more and better questions of ourselves and let those questions lead you to different actions, right? I do agree that self-accountability is number one, right? And so you can't drag other people into accountability. You can't drag other people into believing what you believe. These conversations with our neighbors and our families and our friends, they're not gonna go that well all the time. But you as an individual have to be committed, and you have to be connected to other people who are committed in order to really sustain this over time.
I'd like to just comment, to come back to John and to thank you for your statement. To thank you for the people in the audience, because I think that it's not enough to be introspective, to be the hermit, and to come to this kind of consciousness, but it's important to put it out there because that's a part of sort of behavior change. It's an important piece of behavior change. It's like admitting I'm an alcoholic. That one can move forward from there. And I think your stepping forward really, I think, is a behavior that could be emulated by many to the good of us all. So I thank you.
And to add on to that, what's different about this movement than maybe the previous 2 decades is people who really are deeply involved in this movement are saying that there has to be action. Back in June, a Washington Post columnist headed his column with something that will always stick in my mind. His name was Trey Johnson. And he wrote, when Black people are in pain, white people just join book clubs. Now is not the time to simply only be introspective. And so my concrete advice for the audience is to do what many African Americans have to do almost on a daily basis. When something racist is happening, you gotta call it out. And I've lived too long to know that in homogeneous all-white groups, often things are said and things are done that someone believes is racist, but they don't call it out. In fact, it's well documented by a sociologist, Joe Fagan, and his colleagues, who wrote a book called Backstage Racism, where they collected accounts of young students who said that they were raised in families that purported to be families that believed in equality for everyone, yet they behaved in different ways behind closed doors. And my notion is, even though I'm not a member of a white family, that's true, because I have white people who are members of my family. And so one concrete thing that everyone can do is start calling it out on people and stop accepting what your cousin says just because your cousin isn't educated, or, oh, Uncle Fred's not long for this earth, and so we just ignore him. That hasn't worked.
It's an excellent point, Dr. Nickerson, and it's especially important, message and messenger too. White people, especially people who have not yet grappled with their own inherent racism, need to hear those messages from somebody who looks like them, in my opinion. They need to hear that from me, for example, a white cisgendered, straight guy from Colorado, because that will be more resonant than perhaps it would be from somebody who isn't from, that particular community. So it's important that, we sometimes set aside notions of wanting to be polite, of not wanting to create conflict, and call something what it is. Call racism what it is, call sexism and homophobia what they are, and say them to the people who are perpetrating them.
So I do want to add one last piece to kind of, before we go into the next question, that is a practical piece for white folks. And then I want to kind of talk about people who are not white folks, because we are also a part of trying to have these discussions, and they're just as difficult for us, right? But I think for white people, there's something called the good and bad binary, right? And so I think when a lot of white people think about what does a racist mean, or what does it mean to be a white person, they think on a spectrum between, the KKK and MLK. And so anyone challenging them or talking about how racism is showing up in their lives becomes the bad, the bad version, the boogeyman. And so they run in the other direction, right? And so they do this thing called, everyone knows Robin DiAngelo, she wrote White Fragility, right? So she also has this concept called credentialing, which is trying to drop all of these notes about either I'm so sorry, or I'm so outraged, or I remember I went to the AFI movie theater in Silver Spring to watch the documentary about MLK's life. And it was mostly white people in the audience, white older people. And every time they showed, sort of white counter protesters during the marches and stuff, everyone in the audience gasped, loudly. And I found myself kind of laughing about it after a while, because I was looking around what are you guys trying to prove? We're watching a documentary about MLK. We know that there's going to be some racists in this movie, right? And so I think white people, when they have these really gut reactions to conversations about race, they might be experiencing guilt, they might be experiencing embarrassment, right? And they have to think about, am I feeding into that good and bad binary? There is no good, bad. It's just, we are all here, we all drink the Kool-Aid. Let's figure out what we're gonna do about that. And then I think, to speak to people of color, to Black people, to non-Black people of color, we also have to be willing to be talking, to talk specifically about anti-Blackness and how it manifests in our communities. And I also mean anti-Blackness manifests in Black communities, right? And so there are ways that we sort of split and say, oh, well, those Black people over there aren't like us, right? Because they're poor, because they're on welfare, because they're trans, because, whatever it might be. And so we also have to be willing to have those conversations in our communities, and with, especially with ourselves, right? I think I've sort of been on a consistent journey for years, noticing the ways that I have been complicit in anti-Blackness, or in colorism, or in all of these different manifestations of racism. So I think that there has to be a piece there. It's not just that, you know, white people take it away, solve racism for us. There also has to be self-determination and engagement on the part of people who are impacted by racism, because part of it is internalizing racism.
And I just want to just interject and first say, John, thank you very much for your comments. I really appreciate it. Because it's a lot for you to say that and to come out and it's in front of this whole group to say how you felt and how you are changing and continuing are going to be a student. So I really appreciate that and I take it to heart. Dr. Nicholson, I like your comment. You say call it out. But I think as I sit here and listen to you saying that, I think of myself here in Prince George's County, growing up in Prince George's County. And my parents didn't put me into the public schools because of what was going on in the public schools. I went to all Catholic school from first grade to 12th grade. And sitting here now as an elected official, I guess I still have great pause when you say call it out, because I look at University of Maryland across the street on Route 1. I look at a community, Lakeland, which is all African-American community. And we were taught, you don't call it out because there's gonna be repercussions when you call it out. So how do you, I guess, steps to help feel comfortable in calling it out and steps to help people who are Caucasian or white to understand we're going to start doing this more and more, but it's not to be in a punitive way, but helping you to accept where we need to go in order to be this very diverse community in College Park. So I understand, because I've been here since 1976.
Well, I can tell you that I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And so many of my answers and responses are rooted in moving people forward in a positive way. And so one of the most important things is to have a support system and to educate oneself as well. But the support system can be really, really fundamental in calling it out, because you're right, there could be some social and familial repercussions if you call out Aunt Betty's racist rants every Thanksgiving. You have to have other people on board. I think about what we do with people who are struggling with addiction as well. And one of the first things that someone who really is on the road to recovery is required to do, and we know that research tells us this is really important, is to say, I am an alcoholic. That's calling it out. And you've heard that said by my colleagues, Ms. Wheeler and Dr. Barber, and by Mr. Riggs or Councilman Riggs. You do have to first call it out. I am acknowledging that it's painful and that it could be some social repercussions. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that you might, people might be uneasy with you during the next Thanksgiving. But listen, sitting silently has not worked. My wife works in a setting in which the first time you walk into the room, people saddle up to you and ask you, oh, so you're Dee's husband, what do you do? And my wife got used to people surrounding me, and then she would see the crowd dispersing as I told people what they do. Those are the social implications when you tell people the kind of work that you try to do. So once again, in summary, Councilperson Mitchell, I don't want to pretend like calling it out won't have repercussions, but to move forward, you must do it. You must do this work. This work is hard. It can be painful. You must do it. but have a support system and educate yourself as well. Those are important first steps.
I have one thought about that as well. It has to do with being clear about why you're calling them out. You can call them out because, as an affirmation of yourself. That is, that I am offended by what you're saying. It's inaccurate and it's offensive to me. That's different than trying to change the other. Because we all, at least in my own experience, even within my own family, that simply calling them to try to change them, to change their hearts, is probably not going to work that way. And so the most that I can do is to say, this is not something I want you to do in my presence. And if you continue to do it, I will have to pull out because it hurts me. On the other hand, if you are interested in changing, it seems to me that it comes not so much from the calling out, but from creating a position of empathy. My wife is always amused and amazed and pleased when she goes to West Virginia, of all places, and see these white grandmothers with their black babies, their black grandchildren, how loving they are. And it seems to me that a personal connection to someone can often soften and alter and shift your emotions about first an individual and then maybe a group. And so I just summarize by saying, be clear about what your goal is and whether it's realistic when you decide to do the calling out.
I also want to just add, I don't know if you wanted all these answers to your question, Ms. Mitchell, but I just love this question that you asked because it's so real. I think the repercussions, particularly as a Black woman, that you might face for talking explicitly about race, and not even about race, but just about your own experience, the ways that people might respond to that. It reminds me of, and this is not to say, oh, you're like my mother. I don't want to be like that. But on Facebook,
that's all right.
On Facebook, I talk very explicitly about race. I talk very explicitly about sexuality, gender identity, and all of that. And my mom, she texts me at least once a week to say, Sika, can you just tone it down a little bit, right? Out of worry for me. And her worry is absolutely real, right? But I think that the reality is especially for Black folks, especially for Black women, you can't win either way, right? You call it out, you get pushback. You don't call it out, then you're tearing yourself up about, I can't believe I didn't say anything. It just is, I think the difficult thing is we continually center other people in our minds, yes. Right? Yeah. What am I going to do about them? How am I going to respond? How am I going to convince them? It's about centering yourself. You don't have to say anything about race if you don't want to, right? That's your choice. The ways that you move through this moment and your own resistance is about you. And so you get to decide what that looks like for you. So I just wanted to give you that affirmation.
Thank you.
Rob, do you want to remind people about how to submit comments?
If they need to submit comments, we could have them send them to our city clerk and she will pass them off to us. I know that we've gotten 2 and we've answered them except for one. I want to go back to that a little bit later. But
and just
I think,
you may want to say the email address again so that people know. The CPMC at collegeparkmd.gov.
There you go.
If people,
so,
as we come to an end, just want a reminder that people can still submit questions or comments. Thank you.
Yes, and if they submit questions and we don't get to them, we can always get answers and we will get directly back to them as quickly as possible in a written format. We will respond to those emails. So, one of the big things that's happening right now is we have a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of people walking the streets and out there pushing the points. But how do we get from those protests to creating real policies and getting those put in place throughout our country, throughout our communities. And I can tell you, we do a lot here in College Park by addressing issues that we see that we need to address. And that we stand up for, you know, and my colleagues will tell you, I don't take it lightly when it comes to racism or things like that in our community. That is not something we're about. It's not who we're about. We are very, very lucky here in this region, in the greater College Park, northern Prince George's County region, to have one of the most diverse communities or diverse set of communities in all of the state of Maryland, if not in this region. So, you know, I take that personal. So how do we go about making those policy changes that we see people marching on daily and moving that forward? What do you think our steps should be and how we should be moving to help? I know one thing I see it as is voting. I could go on for days about that, but you know, how do we make that happen? How do we get from the protests to the policy change?
I just wanted to say that I think this is a really important question. And I think that protests and policies are not necessarily two separate processes, right? I think we can see how protests really moved us into the moment that we're in now, have moved us to, you know, getting some form of response about the police who killed George Floyd. If those protests hadn't happened, would we even be having this conversation, right? And so I think we have to really be able to see, it's just, especially because I hear this a lot, not just from white people, but from folks of all races, who, you know, say those kids should get out of the street, you know, get a job, whatever. I've been to protests and, you know, people will drive by, get a job. And it just is, we have to understand that protest is one piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle, but it's one piece of the puzzle that for sure puts pressure on power. And the reality is we don't have a whole lot of folks in power who have the political will to move forward anti-racism in a meaningful way, because moving that forward would mean a relinquishing of a lot of power, right? It would mean a complete restructuring of the ways that our cities are built, of the ways that we deal with housing insecurity, of the ways that we deal with violence against people who do sex work, or the opioid crisis that we are deep in, right? And so we have to, yes, I would like to see mass turnout when it comes to voting this election, because I'm quite afraid of what's about to happen. And at the same time, we have to be thinking about what is going to bring safety to people right now, right? And so I think sometimes that happens through policies, but a lot of times people put policies on the books and then they're not really enforced, right? So we were talking about 8 Can't Wait earlier. Eric Garner died of a chokehold, and there's already a policy on the books that chokeholds were banned in New York. And so we have to be able to see beyond policies and really rethink, A, who is in power, but also how is power being wielded? What are ways that we can challenge the folks that are in power? What are ways that we can keep our community safe in our community, right? And so when people are doing actions like, mutual aid projects, trying to get people food, trying to get people hygiene products, trying to prevent people from getting evicted, we are about to enter into a devastating eviction crisis. These are just as important as policies because they bring safety and dignity to people. And so that's my piece on policies, and I'll allow Dr. Nickerson and Dr. Barber to talk more about those.
Yeah, I guess I've been interested in the process of social change as a way of improving people's lives. And I have a gentle metaphor that I find helpful. And it's like, and so the question is, what's the role of protests in relationship to improving people's lives? And I think that the protests play a very important role, like the gardener who has to prepare the soil before planting. And if we think about it, the environment, the conversation is very different now as a consequence of many of these protests. Think 4 years ago and 8 years ago, I've bemoaned the fact that I've never heard the word poor, that none of the candidates ever talked about poverty or race. And now at least one major, both parties really are talking about race, but in a very different way. So these movements have made this issue front and center. So in a sense, they prepared the soil, but that's not enough. And so what I think is someone needs to plant some seeds. And the seeds are perhaps technical, perhaps programmatic, but so you need a host of people who can think through policies, think through how to implement big ideas like reforming police departments or creating a true anti-poverty program. These are difficult and technical and require a variety of skills. And so you need a range of people who are going to be involved. And you need politicians who have the gumption, the courage to push, to lead, and to make these programs and policies possible. I was very, very amused that Senator Thune, who's not the most liberal of Republican senators, was talking Black Power, because his state was affected by some of these insurrections, some of these demonstrations, some of these protests, that he was forced to say, we have to do something. Would that have happened several years ago? I do not think so. It would have been the furthest from his mind. And so I think that these protests are important, but I think we also need people, maybe a lot of the people in this room, to begin to select the seeds, to plant them and to water them so that they grow.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to ask our panelists, I know that we started a little late today. It is approaching 9 o'clock. I don't want to cross over your timeline too much. Is it okay to go for another 15 minutes or so? And
That's okay with me.
all right, so I'm going to ask one more question here, and I think that it will kind of bring all this together and what we're talking about today. Are there any challenges today that make the racial equality work harder than in the past? And how does that relate to the Black Lives Matter movement? Is that that we could use it as a catalyst? Anyone?
Two things come to mind. One is an over-reliance on representation. I think it's amazing to see people of color, to see queer folks, to see folks who we would have never thought would have gotten into positions of leadership, formal positions of leadership. It's amazing to see them in those positions. But I think sometimes we think that just, let's replace the police with more Black police, or let's put more, Latinx people into positions of power. That's great, but is what they are supporting and the actions that they're taking, are those really supporting the community? Are they really challenging the system that has been perpetuating these kinds of beliefs in this culture? And so I think that's one thing that people can get really stuck on, right? Is if they see, different people who look different or who come from different backgrounds, then we have solved it. And it's just, and in some ways it actually takes us back, because then we are not able to critically examine what's actually going on, right? I think an example that comes to mind is the way that people romanticize President Obama's tenure as president, where he was, immigration detention was also a huge problem. There were also kids in cages during his time, but people struggle to see that because, they celebrate that he was a Black man as a president. And I celebrate that too. And also, I still am gonna hold you accountable because you have a lot of power, right? And so I think we need to be talking about power, not just representation. The other piece is reforms that don't actually get us anywhere, right? And I think when, especially since we're talking about policing, when we talk about prisons, because when we're talking about policing, we are directly talking about prisons. Police don't just, brutalize people or arrest people and then they just disappear. They go to prison, right? And so when there's this concept called reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms. So no one is thinking that, oh, let's just get rid of prison, let's just get rid of the police, and one night, boom, it's gone. What we're saying is, if that can be the goal, right? I'm not gonna say for anybody else on this call, but I want a world without police. I want a world where people are not in cages and where people are not in solitary confinement and incarcerated in psychiatric institutions. So if we believe that world is possible, which I believe it is, then what are the steps that we need to take along the way to get there? And so, for instance, the "8 Can't Wait" banning chokeholds or body cameras, these things have been proven to not work, and in some cases actually make the issue harder, right? Everyone was talking about body cameras after Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and the reality is that 93% of body cameras are actually used to prosecute people, right? And so the amount of prosecution and people ending up in prison has increased because of increased body cameras. We have to be really suspicious of giving these systems of policing more tools to surveil people, to punish people, to lock people up. And so when we talk about reforms, yes, there has to be a certain amount of reform, but what are we trying to reform? Are we just ending up in the same cycle where we keep saying, let's dialogue and then also give police more surveillance technology, let's give police more money, let's put more police on the streets because, places are under police? That's not the solution. That ends us up in the place where we are now, where every single day there is yet another case of a Black person being shot, or another person, because police brutality also happens to people who are not Black, but it disproportionately affects Black folks, right? And so we have to be able to see, what is this cycle that we keep ending up in, and what is going to actually end that cycle? Not make the cycle feel better, right? Not make the cycle look better, but what is actually going to end it?
You're on
Dr.
mute.
Barber? Yeah.
Oscar, you're muted. We didn't hear your intro.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So the question was, what about the circumstances now are worse? It makes the possibility of equality more difficult to achieve or more challenging. And I'll give you 4 words: education, health, income, and housing. The status of African Americans on each of these dimensions is worse than it was years ago, which means that we have less political clout, less economic power to be able to have our interests taken seriously. With respect to education, someone interested in the achievement gap, the gap between what our kids are learning and what they need in order to have sufficient self-sufficiency is growing wider and wider. In terms of health, the threats to our health, we see it with COVID, the absence of good primary care, the absence of reasonable health insurance makes particularly men, but our entire community more vulnerable to diseases and die from diseases that could be treated successfully. And so they're dying off earlier than they need to. Economic status. There has been a secular decline in the ability of someone with a high school education to support a family. So that means even with a college education, 2-year college education, a high school education, their ability to support a family, even with a working spouse, with 2 persons working in the household, is less and less likely, which adds to the instability of family life. And then housing. We're entering a most significant crisis in which the federal government has abandoned its role, so that poor people face increasing challenges regarding affordable housing. They don't have livable wages, and they don't have stable housing. And then these problems cycle on themselves. If you don't have stable housing, education becomes, because kids are moving from place to place. That's one of the biggest hidden issues in our education achievement gap. And so across all four, I think that we are worse off than we were 20, 30 years ago.
So I'm going to agree with everything Dr. Barberin and Ms. Wheeler have said, but I want to boil it down to a couple of key concepts. Number one, this country has never told the truth and reconciled on our birth. We've never really fully told the truth about how it came to be that for profit and gain, a group of people from a continent were conscripted into lifetime and multi-generational, brutal, inhumane bondage that eventually resulted in Jim Crow, resulted in a war, resulted in lynching, and now resulted in modern day lynching. And we've never really told the truth. I am amazed at the number of people who are arguing that the Black Lives Matter movement is un-American and not really understand that there would be no United States of America if it weren't for a group of people rebelling in Boston against paying taxes to the King and Queen of England. That was a protest movement. It was a rebellion. And guess what? It was an armed rebellion. But people have not really been told the truth about that. People have not really been told the truth about people standing out and saying that you are a traitor if you believe in Black Lives Matter movement, but yet please give us our Confederate monuments. When Confederates, and I'm not mincing my words, they were traitors. They rose up against the United States of America in open rebellion and secession, and they lost. Yet they should be paraded out as heroes now and have monuments. We really have not told the truth. We have not told the truth about why police forces were even developed. They weren't developed to keep law and order. They were developed because the 13th Amendment had a clause in it that said slavery would be abolished except in the instances of people who had committed crimes. And so throughout the South, including my home state, Texas, police forces were created to find minor crimes to re-enslave people through the prison complex. We have not really told the truth. And we have not told the truth about how all of this is entangled in profit and economic gain for certain groups. That makes it very difficult to move forward in a world today when someone who owns a multi-million dollar company allows certain things to be posted on a social media platform that he started, and he had agreed that they would not allow these things posted if violence were a part of it, yet they admitted that the guy who went to Kenosha, Wisconsin and killed someone was actually responding to posts on this particular social media platform. But it's profit. You have to think about what it would do if they decided they weren't going to allow these kinds of posts. So in the end, once again, I agree with everything that was said, but I'm also urging us, we have not told the truth about the United States of America and how we've come to this point.
Can I add one last piece? Because I really appreciated what Dr. Barberin talked about in terms of housing and education and poverty. The solutions to these problems are actually quite simple, right? People don't have housing, you give them housing. If communities don't have economic power, you find a way to get that economic power into their hands. What's not simple is how do you get there, right? That becomes a complex issue of how do we solve this? How do we undo this system that has been weaved together? But I think sometimes people are sort of asking the wrong question where, you know, they're like, something has to change. What do we do? What do we do? But we know what to do. It's not easy what to do. But the thing is, it requires giving up the entitlement, right, that exists, that, well, this is just the way that things are, and well, we can't take this away from the, you know, if you're really, you know, to speak colloquially, if you're really about it, you know what the solution is, right? I think that people are not, people are in denial sometimes, but they know what's going on, right? We know that there are plenty of empty houses and empty condos and, you know, all of this kind of stuff that exists, and yet they are reserved for people who are wealthy and who can afford them. So we have to be able to realize sometimes when we are actually making the issue more complicated than what it is, and be willing to be creative about how to get to that solution.
Rob, do you mind if I make a quick comment?
No, go ahead.
Something Dr. Nickerson said really resonated with me, and it made me appreciate how fundamentally patriotic the Black Lives Matter movement is in the greatest democratic sense of the country. It is a movement that's asking, begging, and demanding that we live up to our highest ideals, the ideals that were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States, but have never really been fully realized. We collectively are a work in progress, just as we individually are works in progress. And to understand the Black Lives Movement as anything other than an expression of those democratic ideals is to completely misapprehend the entire movement. And to paint it as anything other than, in my opinion, to paint it as anything other than a patriotic movement to make us live up to those ideals is to distort it. So, you know, Dr. Nickerson, I very much appreciate your comments, and Ms. Wheeler as well, because it is true, and it needs to be widely acknowledged and acknowledged as such.
So I am going to ask our panelists, and John, I want to thank you for that.
Sorry.
I want to ask our panelists if they have any last comments or general statements they would like to make. And then I am going to close us out for the day because we have had a great conversation. But I am going to start with Dr. Barberin. Do you have any closing statements you'd like to make? Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted, Oscar.
Okay,
There you go.
I'm muting myself. I'll keep this short because I know you all want to go. I'll simply say that there have been a lot of great ideas and insights offered around the table. And I just hope that take it to heart and meditate on it and do something about it. Thank you.
Dr. Nicholson?
So I want to go back to the beginning when our kickoff was interrupted by racist, sexist, homophobic screeds. My parting comment is we are deluding ourselves if we believe they don't still walk among us. We live in a wonderful, I am your neighbor. I live in Beltsville. I love Prince George's County. I'm a proud resident of Prince George's County. I guess my wife and I weren't smart enough to move to College Park, so we got to Beltsville, but that's okay. You
can still change that, Dr. Nickerson.
Okay, but I am amazed at how many people don't understand that they still walk among us. They're in our
That
family.
is very, very true.
They're at
Very
the
true.
grocery store. You're deluding yourself if you think they aren't still here.
We have to realize that this is life. And if you think that it's all roses, you haven't looked past the bud. So, and then I'm going to go to Ms. Wheeler. I want to keep calling you Dr. Wheeler, but Ms. Wheeler,
Call me Dr. Wheeler. Just kidding. I'm kidding. But yes, I do have some final words. I just want to shout out some local people who are organizing and doing this work. It's great to support, you know, these national orgs and national funds that are doing anti-racist work. But, you know, we also need to be looking in our own backyards. I think you can make a bigger dent in some of these smaller organizations that really need people's support. So first of all, shout out to Lakeland Community Heritage Project. Please support them within this area. Also Community Justice, PG County Mutual Aid, Baltimore Harm Reduction. These are just a couple of organizations that I'm aware of that are doing amazing, amazing work that is really, you know, deeply nuanced and really bringing safety and security to our communities. And then I want to offer two resources. One is transformharm.org. It's a sort of a curriculum, a huge compilation of all of these different resources, multimedia resources, like anything that you want to know about policing, about Black liberation, healing, community accountability. I think it's just an awesome resource that I go back to again and again. And then the last piece is 8 to Abolition. I know there's A Can't Wait, but 8toabolition.org has been hugely helpful to be able to think about. I think earlier I referenced abolitionist reforms as opposed to reformist reforms. So if you're curious about that, go to 8toabolition.org.
Well, thank you. So first, I want to thank all of our panelists. I think you have done a wonderful job. This conversation is something that needs to continue happening. I think we all need to make sure that we do our part to put a message out there about where we would like to see things go, how we get there, and what are the goals that we really would like to see come out of, you know, the conversations and growing our society. I want to thank each one of y'all from the bottom of my heart. Major Holland, Dr. Barberin, Dr. Nicholson, Ms. Wheeler, thank you guys for the help that you've given us and the insight. And I know this conversation could go on for days. So don't be surprised if I don't reach back out to pick your mind about a few other little small things here and there. I also want to take the time to thank our staff here at the City of College Park, Ms. Barber, Mr. Ryan, our city manager, Janine Miller. These types of community forums would not be happening if it wasn't for the support that they have given us and continue to give us. And it just shows the type of staff that we have here in College Park. I want to thank my colleagues from the council. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your input, your insight. This conversation, as you know, is not ended. It will be continuing. And I thank you for that. Please continue this conversation. Ms. Wheeler, I will finish off, you know, you stole a little thunder there. One of our next forums that we will be having is going to be about the Lakeland community. And we will be talking about what they're doing and talking about, you know, the future of what we can do as a city to acknowledge and address some of the things that are going on in Lakeland and have gone on in Lakeland. So that's coming soon. I can't say a date yet, but we're working on that. And I will end this by saying this one thing. What kind of world, just think about this, what kind of world would we have if we didn't have to use qualifiers for every statement we made, such as black, white, gay, straight, you know, all the different things that we try to use to identify a certain group, and we could just talk about humanity as a whole. It is the ultimate goal is to get there to treat all people with respect and to treat them like they are your brother or your sister. We're all one family trying to reach a certain goal in life. And I hope that we can continue to work towards that by having conversations like what we've had today. And I thank you guys tremendously. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Great job.
Great job, Robert. Thank you.
Thanks. All the panelists, this was a great conversation. Really appreciate the opportunity.